What did you learn from Jeff in these letters? Is there any key sort of takeouts of why did it strike you so much when you read these that you said earlier that you wish you'd read them earlier?
There's just a lot of like tried and tested approaches to doing business and the why they do business. Now, the kind of thing to be aware of is obviously, as you said, they're shareholder letters, and so they're going to be much more optimistic than pessimistic, and so everything does have
they're state news, aren't they?
That's exactly right. It is the state propaganda rolling out, and so kind of just weighing that in, you can see a lot of the kind of decision logic that goes into things from the previous year. And there's also a lot of accountability held for what they're trying to do next within the letters. And you can kind of see the thread of that go through. He also calls out some of the failed enterprises that they've done and in the letters, and makes a point that because we try things, we will fail at some, at things we do. So what would be the biggest learning? I think it really reinforced about the importance of culture. I think all the stuff around technology and operational excellence and all that stuff is, I think that's already fairly common, knowledge that you need to bring all this behavior into the business. But I think really emphasizing that you behave, or you say to behave and act in a way that you say you behave is so important, and that building the culture that is the ultimate lever of the business. And I'd probably say, mate, coming off the back of all the letters, that it seems that culture has been the greatest lever throughout the entire history of the company, bigger so than what the technology is that they've built it on is.
So, and why do you think that's helped? Such a strong culture's helped them so much, as opposed to other companies?
Well, I think one important bit is that they actually act in the way that they say they act. I think that's a huge thing that many companies don't do. The classic one we brought up before was about cost. Actually cutting those costs because they say that they will always cut the cost because it's in the interest of the customer to cut the cost. Yes, it has many other positive benefits to the business, but that's the way that they're going to always act. So that's, I think, a starting point. It also means, employees are the business, and the most important element of the business is the talent. And so by having unique characteristics that are kind of preached about and professed about, and that actually aren't, like, when you go into a company that says that they do things in a particular way, and then you see that they don't really happen in that way, the culture, the values and the behavior are all just a bit of fluff. Whereas when you go into a company that actually acts in the way that they say that they're going to act, and that you can see that's kind of at its core, I think it emboldens the employees, which are the greatest assets of the company, to do things in line with that mission. And so it's like this compounding benefit. It's just like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. That resonates with me.
What was the greatest thing for you, mate, from all the letters?
I think just how I think that the way he was able to just understand and be very strategic very early on. So somehow he kind of understood what was coming. And then he set himself up, because he'd taken the time to understand that so well, I believe. He put in line a really, really robust strategy that understood the fundamental drivers of success and the way that it all worked together as a system. So, like we were saying earlier, that if you made a customer-centric company, more customers would come, which would mean he'd have a bigger company, which would make it more defensible, but also allow him to get more economies of scale to make customers more happy and attract more customers again. So once he figured that out, and then in 1997 mapped out what the key focuses were, customer-centric, cash flow, and sort of innovation, data and systems-driven operational excellence. He knew what his machine needed to be. So then he set about creating a culture that cared about those things and always reinvesting in those principles, because he kind of knew from first principles that reinvesting in customers, even if it didn't necessarily make sense in the way you could measure it on the page at the moment, would bring better returns in the longer term. It just would pay off because he just understood the way it all worked. So it meant that he could do things that others, and could be brave enough to do things that others wouldn't, because he fundamentally understood the drivers of the company. And I think that for me was the biggest learning and the most interesting thing about the whole series of letters. And then probably a close second, which we haven't quite touched on yet, is kind of the innovation within the company was pretty cool.
Yeah. I do want to get into that, mate, but yeah, what do you think allowed? Yeah. What do you think allowed him to get such insight or such foresight into some of these things? And what I find quite interesting here is that, Bezos is an extremely analytical person. He's been known to kind of overemphasize data and just be completely rational in that approach, or almost irrational towards data is a better way of saying it. So I imagine that in order for him to come up with, these four guiding pillars, which is the customer centricity, the cash flow, not dividends, absolutely data driven, and the hiring of, very talented and versatile employees, to come up with these, it almost feels like he came up with a formula to work it out, or he came up with a formula to work out that a customer centric approach is the best way to go. And so my question is, like, how do you come up with what those pillars would be? Because as you mentioned, not all companies are better off suited to being a completely customer-centric business. But maybe, I don't know. I wonder whether in order to be a company of the magnitude that Amazon is set to become in the coming years, whether you can be that big without being totally customer centric.
Perhaps not. They're kind of separate questions. I'll take the first one. Is that I think you need to firstly figure out what you're trying to build in terms of what are you building it for, and if it's usually you, what do you want from the company? If you want to build a fucking huge business, this is a good way to do it. But not everyone does. Very few probably do. And then the other attributes of it will matter a lot too. Like Jeff probably spent the last 20 years of his life working 90 hours a week or something. I don't know. but I would say he'd had to work pretty bloody hard to do this. And so there's a lot of factors there. Once you kind of understand that, I think it's partly around understanding the world around you and being very curious to kind of get the knowledge of how stuff works. Like when I say how systems work, I mean like how does the world work? Like how does the bakery make money if you want to study a business, you know? Why are there so many small businesses in this area but only big ones in certain sectors? You know, how do all these interplays happen? Why, you know, how does politics work? How does anything work? You know, but it's mostly around how humans interact together, right? So it's kind of like finding out those fundamental laws. And if you do that, you'll likely start to see trends and things that are starting to happen that weren't there before. And you might be able to start to understand some high-level cause and effect relationships in the short term that you think might keep going into the longer term. And I think that's how you develop a strategy. And you'll start to see it, and then you can kind of crystallize it if you think about it for a long time. But I would advise not to just sit there thinking about that. You want to be doing something, and it'll probably just start working, and then you'll just have to like figure out why it actually works. That's how most inventions happen. It's the same with businesses, I reckon, and that's a very startup-y mantra, you know. Find a product market fit or whatever they call it. But yeah, effectively, you might be able to just kind of tinker till you get something right, and then you'll figure out why it works. And then once you understand the drivers of that and you think it's going to keep going, well, then you just can really hone in on those things. And I'm not sure which way Jeff did it, but it was probably a combination of the two. I think he's probably someone who's had a lot more foresight than others. And had a bit of a longer plan. And I wonder whether that was because of his time in the markets and the stuff he did analysing other companies.